Budget Committee will come to order. We continue to extend our very best wishes and affectionate regards to Senator Grassley, who is actually here. And he and I encountered each other at the vote last night, and he was his usual cheerful self. And we hope we'll be back. But in the meantime, Senator Johnson has been kind and courteous enough to stand in for him as the ranking member. So I'm grateful to Senator Johnson for that. I welcome all the witnesses. We are here this morning to discuss how investments in expanding housing affordability can drive American economic growth. For decades, our country has faced a housing affordability problem. It's a market failure, many years in the making. And the 2008 financial crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic didn't help. After the housing market collapsed in 2008, new housing supply for single and multi-unit buildings declined. Even as demand recovered, supply continued to lag. Now, housing is taking up a larger share of Americans' household budgets, and low and middle income families are being priced out of the market. Owning a home, once seen as a foundational piece of the American dream, is further out of reach for more Americans than ever before. The National Association of Realtors finds that first-time home buyers made up just 26% of home buyers in 2022, compared to 38% in 1981. And today, the typical age of a first-time home buyer has risen to a record high of 36 years old, up from 29 years old in 1981. With fewer people able to purchase homes, more people must rent, and that's created a shortage of rental units, driving up the cost of rent. New research finds that half of all renters in the United States spend more than 30% of their income on rent and utilities, more than at any other time in history. Across the country, the U.S. faces a shortage of 4 to 7 million housing units available for sale or rent. In Rhode Island, there are currently no communities where families earning the state's median income can afford to buy a typical home. And there's only one town where Rhode Islanders earning the state's median income can affordably rent. According to Zillow, the Providence area experienced the largest year-over-year rent increase in the country last year, a 7.5% increase. The squeeze is bad for our entire economy. It's bad for income inequality. It's bad for families, and it's particularly bad for young people. I've heard from young people around Rhode Island about the importance of affordable housing, and I intend to do something about it. Unaffordable housing decreases job retention and lowers productivity. It can force businesses to relocate, taking job opportunities with them. A lack of available housing reduces local tax revenue, reducing local resources for education, public safety, and infrastructure. Nationwide, the shortage of affordable housing opportunities costs the American economy an estimated $2 trillion each year. High housing costs reduce disposable income and economic mobility, stifling economic opportunity. Investing in our nation's housing infrastructure would provide relief to millions of Americans and drive economic growth, particularly in local economies. Helping families have a safe, stable place to call home should not be controversial. This isn't red state versus blue state. It's not urban versus rural. Americans in all 50 states struggle with higher housing costs. Today, there's not a state, metropolitan area, or county where a worker earning the local minimum wage at 40 hours a week can afford a modest two-bedroom rental at HUD's fair market rate standard. As a nation, we underinvested in housing. It's created a harmful situation for millions of families, and it is now a significant drag on our economy. So we can and must take action to ensure housing is safe and affordable for all. The Biden-Harris administration has taken sweeping new steps to increase the housing supply, protect renters, and ease cost burdens. The American Rescue Plan kept people housed during the worst of the pandemic recession and laid the foundation for jump-starting new construction. Over $14 billion of the Rescue Plan's state and local fiscal recovery funds have already gone towards expanding housing supply, investing in homeless services, and providing 3.7 million additional households with rent, mortgage, and utility relief. Under President Biden's Housing Supply Action Plan, more new apartments were under construction in 2023 than in any year on record. Our appropriations support housing programs like the Home Investment Partnerships, Community Development Block Grants, and Housing Choice Vouchers. But it obviously isn't enough. Over these next few months, I'll be introducing bills to assist home ownership and access to affordable rentals for lower-income Americans. Next month, with Congressman Panetta and Blumenauer, I'll propose a $15,000 first-time homebuyers tax credit for lower-income Americans, refundable, advanceable, and available for homeowners at the time of purchase. My Democratic budget colleagues have also come to the table with detailed proposals to expand housing affordability. This includes Senator Wyden's DASH Act, the LIFT Act, led by my colleague Senators Warner, Van Hollen, and Kaine, the Fair Housing Improvement Act, led by Senators Kaine and Sanders, Senator Merkley's End Hedge Fund Control of American Homes Act, the Deposit Act, led by Senators Lujan and Padilla, and Senator Padilla's Housing for All Act. We'll hear about many of those programs and proposals today. Ensuring access to safe and affordable housing is a moral and economic imperative. I hope it is something upon which we can find common ground and advance this year. Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I obviously want to express my sentiment for a full and speedy recovery to Senator Grassley, but also for you. I see you're in quite a bit of back pain. I hope you recover quickly. And I'm happy to read Senator Grassley's opening statement. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your calling today's hearing on housing affordability. In Senator Grassley's 99 counting meetings, he regularly hears from Iowans about the lack of housing, especially the price they can afford. I hear the same thing in Wisconsin. I'm sure every senator hears that back in their states as well. While affordable housing is in short supply in many communities, this isn't due to a shortage of federal housing programs. Currently, there are more than 100 housing programs at the federal level costing more than $100 billion per year. This includes over $70 billion in the Department of Housing and Urban Development budget alone. Billions more are provided in programs outside of HUD, including through USDA, the Department of Defense, and the Department of Veterans Affairs. On top of these programs, the tax code includes incentives for home ownership and the construction of low-income housing. There are also government loan guarantees and government-sponsored enterprises to support the housing credit market. Despite this litany of programs, affordable housing concerns remain a perennial issue. In recent years, inflation, driven by reckless federal spending under the Biden administration, has made problems worse. In 2021, the price of homes increased by the largest amount in the history of the Case-Shiller National Home Price Index at 19.3%, and home prices are up over 32% since Biden took office. While good for homeowners, except for increased property taxes, renters felt the pain with rental prices increasing at the third largest amount over the last 100 years in 2022. Rents are now over 19% higher than when Biden took office. Before spending billions more on additional federal housing programs, we should take a good hard look at why existing programs have fallen short. For decades, Senator Grassley has conducted oversight of HUD and local housing agencies, exposing widespread waste, fraud, and abuse. Too often, government overpays for poorly executed projects, and a maze of housing programs creates inefficiencies and a lack of accountability. Senator Grassley has found HUD does very little, if any, oversight of the housing authorities. So they get away with lavish office spending on salaries, vehicles, parties, and travel. All this while poor people wait in line, sometimes for years, for actual housing. Of today's witnesses, Bill Slover knows this all too well from his time exposing waste, fraud, and abuse in our housing programs right here in D.C. While we work to reform and improve our housing programs, the last thing American homebuyers need right now is more budget housing spending, given our dire fiscal situation. As the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office recognizes, higher debt tends to increase borrowing costs in both the public and private sectors by driving up interest rates. Our current decade's high interest rates aren't only causing taxpayers to pay record amounts of interest on the national debt, but also making it harder to afford a mortgage. This past fall, 30-year mortgage rates peaked at nearly 8%, a 20-year high. Left unchecked, our rapidly rising national debt will continue to place upward pressure on interest rates, making the American dream of homeownership less attainable. Senator Grassley understands the desire to do more to help working families obtain affordable housing. but that won't be achieved simply by throwing money at the problem. In fact, it only makes things worse. We need to start by rooting out the enormous amount of waste, fraud, and abuse. We both welcome all of today's witnesses, and I'll only add, the numbers are actually quite shocking. In January 2021, the 30-year fixed mortgage rate average was 2.65%. That's more than 2.5 times over that now at 6.7%. I think the real shocking number is in Q1 2020, the average monthly payment for a new home was $1,787. Now it's 1.86 times higher than that at $3,322 per month, just under $40,000 a year. Those are shocking numbers, and again, caused by massive government spending, which has turned a dollar that people held at the start of the Biden administration into 85 cents. And from my standpoint, that's one of the primary root causes of a very significant problem, particularly for young people. So again, I appreciate the hearing, look forward to hearing more about what the root causes are. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Johnson. I'll introduce the witnesses now. Our first is Ms. Peggy Bailey. She's the Vice President for Housing and Income Security at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and also served in the Biden-Harris administration as Senior Advisor on Rental Assistance to HUD Secretary Marcia Fudge. Welcome, Ms. Bailey. Our second witness is Mrs. Carol Ventura of our own Rhode Island Housing. She's the Executive Director. She has over 30 years of experience in expanding access to housing, building livable communities, and leading economic efforts. She has dedicated her career to helping Rhode Islanders access housing opportunities, and she leads a terrific organization that is very effective. And I actually served on its board for a while as the Director of Business Regulation. So it's wonderful, Carol, to see you here in Washington. Thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise with us. Our next witness will be introduced by our esteemed colleague from the great state of Ohio, who's visiting the Budget Committee today for purposes of making this introduction. Senator Brown.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Ranking Member Johnson, thank you. Tremendous panel you've convened today. I'd like to quickly recognize Ms. Peggy Bailey for her work on my Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. She's shared her expertise with our committee many times. Good to see you, Ms. Bailey. But I'm only going to introduce one member, I promised. I'm honored to welcome longtime friend I've known for 20 years, him and his family, and so many of our friends in common, Frank County Board of Commissioners President. We have 3 commissioners in each county. He's the President of County Commissioners in Columbus. Kevin Boyce, welcome to Senate Budget Committee, Mr. Boyce. He's been a leader in Ohio for more than 2 decades. He was a member of the Columbus City Council. He's been state treasurer, he's been a member of the legislature, and now is county commissioner in Ohio's largest and fastest growing county. Commissioner Boyce deals every day with the housing challenges this committee will discuss today. Central Ohio, as I said, is the fastest growing region in the state by far. Thriving business, growing investment, more and more families are making Central Ohio, especially Franklin County, home. Because of the work we've done to bring crucial industries like semiconductor manufacturing to Ohio, there's tremendous opportunity. That's the good news. The demand for affordable housing will only increase, as will transportation challenges. Columbus residents whose family ties to the city go back generations are now all too often being displaced from neighborhoods that they've called home for decades. Commissioner Boyce is on the front line of these challenges, a member of the board of Franklin County Land Bank, the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission, the County Planning Commission. He's seen the challenges. He's also helping to craft the solutions, and the committee will gain from that today. He brought his expertise to the National Association of Counties. He was co-chair of the Housing Task Force last summer under Commissioner Boyce's leadership. The task force released a report to help communities across the country tackle housing challenges. He also last year, in a very busy schedule, he also helped establish a Delphi Bank, Ohio's first black-owned bank, to advance economic opportunity. I cannot overestimate how important that venture is, how significant that effort is. He serves as a member of Adelphi's board, along with friends whom I've also known for 15, 20, 25 years, former Columbus Mayor Coleman, Karen Morrison, Alex Shoemate, Larry James, helping to support home ownership at some of the most challenging times, helping to support entrepreneurship and investment, particularly in Ohio's black community and Columbus's black community. It's about creating opportunity for people who've been denied for too long to buy homes, start businesses, build wealth, and been victimized by predatory housing investors. Commissioner Boyce, thanks for appearing today to share your expertise. Thank you to the committee for giving me the opportunity, Mr. Chair, to introduce Mr. Boyce. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Brown. Following Mr. Boyce, we will hear from Mr. Bill Slover, who is principal at Avco Interests and a former chair and commissioner of the D.C. Housing Authority Board. Welcome, Mr. Slover. Our final witness today will be Dr. Todd Walker. Dr. Walker is the Walter Professor of Financial Economics and Director of the Center for Applied Economics and Policy Research at Indiana University. He is also a research professor at the Deutsche Bundesbank, the German central bank. We welcome his testimony. And if I may turn first to Ms. Bailey, you may proceed with your statements. Your complete testimony will be made a part of the record, and we look forward to your 5-minute testimony orally.
Thank you, Chairman Whitehouse and Senator Johnson and members of the committee. I really appreciate the opportunity to testify before you this morning. We are currently facing a housing affordability crisis, and it is most acute for people with the lowest incomes who are more likely to be renters. Over the 20-plus years of my career in housing policy, rarely does a week go by where I don't receive at least one call or an email from someone desperate for housing assistance without any idea of where to get help. Every time I reply, I can't shake the worry and concern I have knowing that getting assistance is like hitting the lottery. Solving this problem, rooted in the long-standing and persistent gap between average renters' income and the cost of rent, requires congressional action in 4 key areas: expanding rental assistance, increasing supply of new units, preserving existing affordable housing, and strengthening fair housing and tenant rights protections. In order to solve a problem, the reasons behind the problem have to be properly diagnosed. As a nation, we have spent too long blaming and punishing people for being poor, for not having a home, for being evicted, or for struggling to pay their bills. The primary reason people struggle to pay their rent is that there is a gap between 30% of their income and the general standard for determining housing affordability and their rent cost. Imagine the grocery store worker you depended on so much during the pandemic. This worker might be a single parent with 2 kids. If they make $15 an hour, their salary is about $31,000 a year if they work full-time. 30% of that income a month is $775. Even if the kids share a room, please tell me where that parent can rent a 2-bedroom apartment for $775 a month. With the average monthly rent for a 2-bedroom apartment in 2022 being $1,300, the answer is likely nowhere. As Chairman Whitehouse mentioned, recent estimates from the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard show that about 22 million renters pay more than 30% of their income on rent, and about 12 million of these people pay 50% or more, an all-time high. And this is not a new phenomenon. This chart shows that the gap between rents and incomes is persistent, and even when incomes go up overall, they don't completely catch up with rent costs. Workers with low wages, seniors, people with disability, people living outside, and many other people aren't paid enough through no fault of their own to afford rent. They urgently need financial assistance to afford a place to live. Housing is not a nice to have for any of us. It is a basic human need. Housing assistance prevents people from unnecessarily dying on the street. It helps children do better in school. It prevents evictions that make it even harder for people to find housing, and it helps ensure families don't have to choose between paying the rent or paying for other basic needs like medicine, clothing, and food. It's also an economic issue. People can't work in communities where they can't afford housing. Increasing access to affordable housing helps employers attract employees and creates more jobs, thus stimulating the economy. We need a comprehensive strategy to make rental housing affordable for all. First, Congress needs to fully fund rental assistance to meet the need. In the short term, Congress should fund voucher renewals in 2024. In the long term, rental assistance should be expanded to reach all families who need it, prioritizing the people with the lowest incomes. And Congress should utilize the mandatory side of the budget for rental assistance expansion to ensure funding adjusts as costs and needs rise. Next, we need to invest in revitalizing public housing and other aging affordable housing developments. Existing affordable housing must be preserved or will never keep up with the supply need. Also, we must increase and streamline funding for affordable housing supply, both rental housing and single-family developments. Affordable rental housing is often inexpensive to build and then is often more expensive to build than market rate housing due to complicated financing and other regulations and rules. And affordable single-family housing is needed because it can help ease cost pressures in the rental market and help families attain an important step towards stabilizing their financial futures. Some of these are state and local issues, but program alignment at the federal level is critical. Finally, federal, state, and local governments should increase investment in fair housing solutions and tenant protections that contain rent costs, ensure housing quality, and allow tenants to live in neighborhoods of their choice that work for them and their families. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Ventura.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Johnson, and members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to testify on the serious housing affordability challenges facing our country. I'm Carol Ventura, the Executive Director of Rhode Island Housing, the housing finance agency for the state of Rhode Island. We provide financing and counseling to help low and moderate income households buy and keep a home, provide rental assistance to low-income renters, finance the development and preservation of affordable housing, and service our single and multifamily mortgage portfolios. Like many states, Rhode Island is facing a critical housing shortage, which has contributed to significant increases in housing prices. The state is simply not producing enough housing to meet the needs of its residents. Over the past decade, Rhode Island's rate of housing permitting has ranked last in the nation, and as housing production has slowed, vacancy rates have decreased. Not surprisingly, as vacancy rates have decreased, housing costs have increased significantly. Over the past 5 years, the median price of a single-family home has increased 49%, and the average rent has increased 23%. Across Rhode Island, around 150,000 households, 1/3 of our population, are housing cost burdened. Federal investments made through the American Rescue Plan Act have played an important role helping Rhode Island recover from the effects of the pandemic. The state has invested $321.5 million in state and local fiscal recovery funds to support housing and homeless programs. Rhode Island Housing is administering just over $206 million of these resources. $30 million has provided first-time homebuyers with down payment assistance, and $175 million is financing the development and preservation of affordable housing. To date, over $100 million has been committed to financing more than 1,400 affordable homes, and another $32 million is supporting site acquisition and pre-development activities for 62 proposed affordable housing developments. These new development resources have been particularly impactful because they've allowed us to better leverage other important development resources like the federal low-income housing tax credit, particularly the 4% housing credit. The historic investments that Congress has made in housing and homeless programs have been vital, but much more needs to be done. There are several steps that the federal government could take to address housing affordability challenges. First, increase appropriations for housing production and rental assistance programs. Affordable housing development programs like HOME, the National Housing Trust, and the Capital Magnet Fund are critically important. Inflation, supply chain issues, and increasing land costs have all contributed to significant increases in the cost of housing development. That means we need significantly more subsidy through these programs to produce the same number of units. The cost of renting and operating housing has also risen significantly. To mitigate these increases, more investment is needed in rental assistance programs. Second, pass the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act. One of the most important steps Congress can take to increase the supply of affordable housing is to pass the act. This bill would significantly increase the allocation of 9% housing credits, building upon the success of this powerful financing tool. The act also reduces the amount of tax-exempt bond financing required to access 4% housing credits and making other important improvements to the program. The AHCIA will significantly increase affordable housing production, and we urge you to pass it. I know Congress is currently considering a tax package that includes several important elements of the Act. Rhode Island Housing strongly supports these provisions and urges Congress to act quickly to adopt this important package. Finally, permanently extend the Federal Financing Bank HUD risk-sharing initiative. HUD's risk-sharing program provides mortgage insurance for affordable housing developments financed by housing finance agencies. In 2014, a new tool was made available that combined HUD's risk-sharing mortgage insurance with low-cost financing provided through Treasury's Federal Financing Bank. This program has been a very effective tool in Rhode Island and in many other states, and we urge Congress to make the program permanent. Thank you again for dedicating this hearing to the important housing affordability challenges facing our country. I'm honored to have had this opportunity to testify before the committee and to share Rhode Island Housing's experiences.
Thank you, Mrs. Ventura. We're delighted to have had you here. Mr. Boyce.
Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member Grassley, Senator Johnson, and certainly Senator Brown, thank you for the warm introduction, as well as distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the state of our nation's housing crisis, the approach counties are taking to address it, and the critical role that our intergovernmental partnership plays in crafting comprehensive solutions. My name is Kevin Boyce, and I currently serve as the president of the County Board of Commissioners in Franklin County, Ohio. Additionally, over the last year, I've had the honor of serving as co-chair of the National Association of Counties, NACO, Task Force on Affordable Housing. Franklin County is Ohio's largest county with over 1.3 million residents and one of the fastest growing in the region. Our county seat, Columbus, is the state capital and America's 14th largest city. This size makes our region a major economic engine, not only for the state, but for our nation. Currently, we are home to many national institutions, including the Ohio State University, 5 Fortune 500 companies, and nearly 20 Fortune 1000 companies. This growth does not come without its growing pains, though, which is why I'm honored to join you here today. Housing constraints within our county and the region have increasingly become a focal point of local policymakers, prospective employers, and community members alike. In addition to sharing my personal story on the vital role that stable housing played in my life, I'll be touching on recommendations from NACO on how the federal government can further help and support counties' local efforts to increase housing accessibility and affordability. Many colliding factors contribute to the current housing affordability crisis. Housing costs have been rising steadily, largely outpacing wages, which is placing an increased financial burden on renters and homeowners alike. In 2021, roughly half of the renters and 1 in 3 homeowners were cost burdened. The median price of homes increased by more than $107,000 in Q1 2020 to in Q1 2023, while rents have increased by 16% in the same time frame. Not only are Americans facing higher housing costs, but the stock available for renting and owning is increasingly limited. Nearly 80% of homeowners who currently have a mortgage hold an interest rate below 5%, keeping housing inventory at record lows. These statistics lend context to a problem counties know all too well. Housing affordability is increasingly out of reach for our residents. In Franklin County, 4 out of every 10 renters are cost burdened, spending more than 30% of their annual income on housing. Since 2010, the population within the county has grown 14%, while total housing units in the county have increased only 10%, further widening the gap. My story is similar to many American families that are stuck in cycles of poverty. In the course of my K through 12 years of primary and secondary education, I attended 11 different schools. Statistics would suggest a pathway of outcomes that reflect trajectory of instability, educational deficiencies, and even potentially incarceration. But I was fortunate to learn 2 very important lessons. First, the best social service is a good paying job. And secondly, housing is fundamental to stability. I sit here today as the former treasurer of the state of Ohio, current president of Ohio's largest county, and the founder of a Delphi bank, but I'm most proud of is seeing the cycle of poverty broken in my own family, where my oldest son is a double Ivy League grad, Brown University, I might add, Mr. Chairman, and my youngest is a senior at a top institution in Los Angeles. My story is just one of countless stories that the American people can tell about housing, how it's changed their lives and changed the lives of future generations. By 2050, the region is expected to grow by more than 1 million residents, with an estimated regional population increasing to 3.15 million. Of that, Franklin County is expected to absorb at least half of the regional growth. With a team of more than 30 of my colleagues from across the country, NACO's Housing Task Force worked to find county-led solutions to address our nation's growing housing crisis. Understanding that counties have governance limitations, we look towards our partnership with our federal government colleagues to enhance the current and future housing programs and ensure that we have required tools to reduce the cost burden facing our homeowners and residents. In collaboration with NACO, I offer the following recommendations. 1, invest additional federal resources to adequately support housing needs. 2, modernize and strengthen current federal programs. 3, provide more direct and local government funding opportunities. And 4, simplify programs and reduce burdensome compliance requirements on local governments. In conclusion, Carol mentioned many of the programs that we support as counties and need more of, quite frankly, but I'd be remiss if I didn't recognize the bipartisan nature working with Senator Brown and Vance, Congresswoman Beatty and Carey, and even my wife, Congresswoman Sykes, to ensure that our partnership impacts the lives of the residents that we all serve. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, thank you so much for having me today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Boyce. We'll next hear from Mr. Slover.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member Grassley, and Senator Johnson, and members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss the critical issue of housing affordability. My name is Bill Slover, and I have over 30 years of experience in both public and private sector real estate. My testimony centers on my near 10 years on the D.C. Housing Authority Board, emphasizing the challenges faced, the impact of poorly functioning agencies on housing affordability, and recommendations for reform. DCHA plays a critical role, housing over 18,000 low-income families with an annual budget of over $500 million. When I was first appointed as chairman by the mayor in 2009, my goal was to enhance affordability and housing quality. Immediately recognizing the need for fundamental change, I pushed for greater accountability, improved financial management. My efforts faced resistance, resulting in my swift removal as chair. My term ended without tangible progress. Rejoining the board in 2015 as the advocate representative, I again pushed for efficiencies, reform, and better financial stewardship. Despite exhaustive efforts, the agency's decline persisted. By the fall of 2021, the situation necessitated reaching out to HUD, resulting in a scathing review published in September of 2022. The HUD report highlighted DCHA's systematic failures through 80-plus findings, including potential violations of conflict of interest for multi-million-dollar contracts and suspected overspending in the $300 million plus voucher program, just to name 2. The HUD report identified 5 principal issues contributing to DCHA's failure, including inadequate oversight, poor management, lack of expertise, and a failure to provide decent, safe housing. The report emphasized the need for immediate remedial action. Rather than addressing the HUD findings collaboratively, the mayor and the D.C. City Council disbanded the independent board, replacing it with mayoral appointees, and awarded the existing executive director a $40,000 bonus. This drastic response removed all independent voices from the board. A year after these changes, there is little evidence of meaningful reform at DCHA. Recent news in the Washington Post highlights continued struggles in the voucher program, the city's largest program. The need for decisive intervention remains. Despite my experience at DCHA, I am a strong believer that PHAs play a critical role in solving the housing affordability crisis. They are tasked with housing as many of our most vulnerable population as possible with the resources they have. It's simple math. If the agency is inefficient and spends more money on basic operations, fewer people get housed, causing a negative ripple effect across the entire housing space. HUD needs to completely rethink its oversight of PHAs, as the current process is failing far too often. Absent this, no amount of money pumped into PHAs will result in sustainable progress towards increased access to housing. Money will not solve what is a failure of execution compounded by a lack of oversight and accountability. HUD should do these 3 things before providing any additional funding to PHAs. Enhanced oversight. HUD must revamp its oversight of PHAs, setting clear key performance indexes to track, report, and achieve results, and intervene as soon as an agency gets off track. Change governance structure. PHA governing bodies need to be held directly accountable to HUD rather than local and municipal leaders. As Senator Grassley has pointed out repeatedly, PHAs rely too heavily on local officials to be good stewards of billions of taxpayer dollars, which is no way to exercise fiduciary responsibility. Demand qualified leaders. Until PHAs can execute the basic functions of managing properties, setting rental rates, and overseeing waiting lists, they will continue to underperform. PHAs are operating businesses and need to be run as such. I hope my experience can inform this committee as it considers how to best allocate taxpayer dollars towards our nation's housing challenges. We need to better understand why costs are so high and production is so low, and begin to make the necessary market corrections needed to increase the efficiencies of the space. Thank you again, and I look forward to answering any of your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Slover. Dr. Walker is next.
Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member Johnson, committee members, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today on such an important topic. It is an honor to be here. With the recent increase in mortgage rates, housing has become substantially less affordable today than just a few years ago. Let's compare two families. Family one purchases the median-priced home with a 20% down payment at the 30-year fixed-rate mortgage available in January of 2021. Family two purchases the same home at today's mortgage rates. Family two will pay an additional $800 per month and an additional $285,000 in interest payments over the life of the loan. For a family making the median income, the additional mortgage payments of $800 per month constitute 20% of disposable income. This prohibitive increase in the cost to purchase a home comes at a time when the price of all goods and services are increasing dramatically. The good news is the rate of inflation has been coming down. The bad news is that changes in the price level since 2020 have made essentials like groceries 25% more expensive. Inflation is a tax on everyone, and families are still feeling the pinch. Housing costs are by far the largest item in a family's budget. If housing becomes more affordable, this makes food, education, childcare, transportation, and all other necessities more affordable as well. What does this analogy have to do with the budget of the United States government? The only difference between these two families is the mortgage interest rate they pay. This interest rate is tightly connected to the interest paid on the 10-year U.S. Treasury bond. Since 1990, these two time series have moved in lockstep with a near-perfect correlation of 0.98. As the common phrase reminds us, correlation is not causation, but in this case, the economics are clear. Causality runs from the 10-year yield to mortgage interest rates and not the other way around. If the interest rate on the 10-year Treasury increases, mortgage rates will increase. If the 10-year yield falls, mortgage rates will fall. So what determines the interest rate on a 10-year U.S. Treasury? This question is much more difficult to answer. However, the long-run foundational anchor of U.S. sovereign debt must be fiscal policy. There are three important considerations for the committee. First, in response to the financial crisis of 2008 and the COVID-19 pandemic, the Federal Reserve engaged in a policy called quantitative easing that depressed the 10-year yield below market-based equilibrium. This diminished the sensitivity of long-dated maturities to fiscal policy over the last 15 years. These policies are currently being undone. As quantitative easing gives way to quantitative tightening, fiscal policy will once again take center stage in price discovery for the Treasury market. Second, paying interest to bondholders or debt service is now the third largest expense of the federal government, only behind Social Security and Medicare. Debt service will soon exceed $1 trillion per year if it hasn't already. The CBO projects debt service to grow to 3.6% of GDP over the next decade, an all-time high. Bond traders recently burned by unanticipated inflation to the tune of a record-breaking 46% decline in bond prices are now much more leery of inflation-inducing fiscal expansions. When inflation is anticipated, higher rates of interest are required to compensate for the lost purchasing power. As debt service grows, it will crowd out other spending needs. Finally, increases in government spending to support the economy during the pandemic were on par with increases to finance World Wars I and II. Following the Great Wars, through a reduction in spending and increases in tax revenue, debt-GDP ratios gradually yet substantially declined. This is consistent with optimal economic policy. Shocks like wars and COVID should be smoothed over time. However, no such fiscal consolidation is currently on the horizon. Sizable deficits are projected for the foreseeable future. This will certainly put upward pressure on the 10-year Treasury yield, making housing less affordable. When it comes to housing affordability, there aren't many things more important than mortgage rates. Given that mortgage rates track the value of U.S. debt very closely, fiscal policies initiated by this committee have a direct impact on housing costs. While other countries have struggled to reopen following the pandemic, the strength of the U.S. economy has been on full display. This economic growth can and should be used to coordinate a well-thought-out and gradual fiscal consolidation consistent with optimal economic theory. Such a consolidation will make housing more affordable. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Walker. Let me first ask Mr. Slover a question for the record, which means you can answer in writing and give a chance to sharpen your pencil and put your head to it. You give general recommendations to make sure that public housing authorities avoid the problem of the DC authority. If you'd be good enough to submit for the record more detailed proposals. You have a lot of members here who've proposed legislation. None of us support fraud or abuse. And to the extent we can get helpful proposals to consider in legislation, consider this your opportunity to do that. Would you be willing to do that?
I'd be very happy to, and I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And Mrs. Ventura, you heard Mr. Slover about his unfortunate experience with the District of Columbia Authority. Are we seeing similar problems around Rhode Island and your dealings with other housing organizations in other states? How endemic do you think the problems are that he has spoken of in the District of Columbia?
We are not experiencing a similar situation in Rhode Island. We have extremely competent housing authorities that are doing solid work on the ground, serving the people of Rhode Island, providing excellent housing opportunities and, frankly, services. Services are very key to help people transition from public housing, the voucher program, into solid working environment, home ownership opportunities. So no, we are not experiencing this, Senator.
And given the number of parties that it takes to pull together a housing deal, when we go to the ribbon cuttings, there are usually 5 to 10 different parties, private banks, consultants, different government funders. There are a lot of eyeballs on these deals before they come to fruition, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So tell me a little bit about your experience with first-time home buyers. The average age for a home buyer climbing from 29 to 36 is a statistic. It's a pretty grim fact for young families. How do you see that playing out, and do we need to repair that?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Chairman. As housing prices have increased, and they certainly have increased along with mortgage interest rates, we're seeing significant increases in the average income of a buyer in Rhode Island and in the size of their mortgages. The average income for a home buyer in Rhode Island in 2023 was $92,000, and that's up around 44%.
You have to be making around $92,000 to be affording a home.
Yeah, over that same time frame, our average loan amount increased to $344,000. So that's an increase of 55% compared with 2019. So there are certainly challenges in the market. One of the barriers that we see to achieving homeownership is the down payment. And that's why the $30 million that our governor set aside for down payment assistance was extremely helpful. We provided a $17,500 grant to first-time homebuyers, and we were able to assist over 1,500 first-time homebuyers purchase their homes. So it was an important tool Unfortunately, those resources are fully reserved, and we don't have any additional ARPA funding available. We'll continue to provide our resource, which is a $10,000 deferred loan, but it's challenging
Yeah.
to find homes that are affordable. You know
Thank
that,
you.
Chairman.
Ms. Bailey, make the policy case between housing affordability and economic growth.
Thank you, Chairman. The connection between housing affordability and economic growth is inseparable. Having affordable housing helps people be able to access work. Also, building more affordable housing creates jobs for the people that are building it and for the people that'll have to operate it. It helps people in general be able to be more stable in the community and engage in work, but engage in all of the things that a community provides. And lastly, being able to provide rental assistance is particularly important because we know that when people with low incomes are given housing subsidies and other subsidies by the federal government, it allows them to invest those resources back into the community. They don't save that money, they spend it in their community, which helps economic growth as well.
And Mr. Boyce, you used the phrase intergovernmental partnerships. That implies a federal role. What is the importance of a federal role in those intergovernmental partnerships supporting adequate housing?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me begin with the many programs that Carol identified, from home funds to choice voucher programs. I mean, all of those are catalysts to helping families, people like me who grew up in a tough and impoverished environment. But moreover, it's the continued creativity around the partnership, having access to new ideas and new resources, and thinking through some of the proposals that allow for increased home ownership, like expanding the duration of mortgage lending, or with the FHA mortgage lending standards, or home funds that allow us to expand affordable housing throughout our community in Central Ohio. There are communities that kind of have the NIMBY syndrome, not my backyard syndrome, where they cite housing standards as a barrier to affordable housing. Those home funds, in many cases, allow us to mitigate the cost of certain materials or certain products that allow us to spread the affordable housing in communities that otherwise might not have the permitting or variance resources to allow for it.
Thank you very much. The order now is first Senator Johnson and then Senator Kaine. I will take advantage of Dr. Walker being here and his connection with Deutsche Bundesbank to put into the record the report from the Network for Greening the Financial System, of which Deutsche Bundesbank is a member, in which the network makes the point that we've made in this committee before, that climate-related risks are a source of financial risk. I'm quoting the executive summary here. Climate change will affect the global economy and so the financial system that supports it. The financial risks it presents are in consequence system-wide, a phrase we've heard repeatedly in our testimony, and potentially irreversible if not addressed. Senator Johnson, without objection, that'll be put in the record. And Senator Johnson, the floor is yours for questions.
Hey, Mr. Chairman, I want to start out telling a little story. A few years ago, I was invited down to Milwaukee to visit and learn about a program called the ACTS, A-C-T-S housing program. It started by a Catholic priest, and basically this Catholic priest was taking advantage of a number of foreclosures on very well-constructed homes in the early 1900s that had fallen into disrepair and were under foreclosure. And he was able to buy these homes for a few $1,000s. And then with the help of private lenders, some Wisconsin banks, individuals that were renting, low-income individuals renting, paying too high a rent, were able to borrow $15,000 to $30,000, put in their sweat equity, and own a home, and literally cut their rental payments in half or more. And it was a great program. I toured a number of homes. The homeowners did a great job of repairing these homes on a shoestring. But one of the main reasons the priest invited me down was to complain about the impact of the low-income housing tax credit on his program. What was happening is contractors were using that low-income housing tax credit. They were snatching up all those homes in foreclosure, putting hundreds of thousands of dollars into those well-constructed homes, and pretty well taking, the opportunity away from lower income individuals. So again, that was a well-intended program, federal government program, impacting a private sector program and disadvantaging low-income individuals. So I just had to kind of tell that. My questions really have to do with, a functioning market. Generally, supply will meet demand, particularly when demand is boosted by $100 billion plus of federal government funding. I'll start with you, Dr. Walker. And this is a general question for everybody. Why isn't supply meeting demand? What is causing it? Obviously, inflation is a huge problem affecting interest rates, causing costs, but go ahead, Mr. Dr. Walker.
So I think based upon the expert testimony, we'll agree that housing affordability is important. I hear a lot of supply constraints. So on the supply side, if it's the supply side and supply constraints are the problem, then some of the policy proposals that are on the demand side, like vouchers, would make the problem even worse. It gets back to your example of an unintended consequence, right? So if you have a demand side solution to a supply side constraint, then you're going to have an increase in home prices, which will make matters worse, or you're going to displace people who don't have access to the voucher. That's going to lead to a race to the bottom where people are going to try to get just below the point where they can access the voucher. Why supply is so constrained, I think there's regulatory issues that could be addressed. Mr. Slover probably has more information about those, but I just wanted to briefly mention, again, based upon your example, there are unintended consequences of all these policies. And I think when you have a supply side issue and you address it with a demand side policy, you have unintended consequences that could be much worse.
I'd like a little more detail on that. Again, I want to just throw out a couple things. Rent controls, obviously keep down the supply because it's just not worth investing in things. Obviously, high interest rates drive up the cost. Overregulation. Mr. Slover, and apologize for mispronouncing your name in the opening statement, but can you enlighten us on this?
To just sort of build on what Dr. Walker was saying, I think one of the unintended consequences of some government programs, I think it's sort of an idea versus execution, which is a way I like to simplify things sometimes. In Washington, D.C., as an example, the D.C. Housing Authority Board approved a rent payment standard of 187% of what HUD thinks fair market rent is. So now the D.C. Housing Authority has 12 to 15,000 rents that they're willing to pay, upwards of 187% of what HUD thinks is the fair market rent. What that does is floods the market with payments that are above what the market is. And that puts pressure on the rest of the market because now you have someone overpaying significantly for units, which pushes up prices lower and also creates an industry where people actually go out and purchase organically existing low-income housing and remove those residents and backfill it with higher-paying vouchers. It's an entire business model out there where people promote a business plan which says, the arbitrage to government-funded subsidies is my business plan. I'm going to buy a building at a cap rate of X. I'm going to empty it out, and I'm going to fill it back in, and my cap rate's going to double because the rent doubled. And that's an unintended consequence.
And that's really exactly what happened in Milwaukee, similar to that, with the low-income housing tax credit. I guess for the majority witnesses, I only say, all you're asking for is more and more federal government spending, and I understand that. Some of it's appropriate, but when we have this massive amount of deficit spending, which is the cause of the inflation, which drives up the interest rates, which drives up the cost of housing, I mean, it's just a self-perpetuating problem. It's not the solution. It's part of the root cause. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Kane, the sponsor of the LIFT Act and the Fair Housing Improvement Act.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the witnesses. This is a very important topic. Since we are in a discussion sort of about macroeconomic trends, I do think it's important to mention the set of articles that have just come out in the last few days, exemplified by one in the Washington Post, January 28, from David Lynch, that I'd like to add to the record. Falling inflation, rising growth give the U.S. the world's best recovery. There are economic challenges, but one of the ways to look at these challenges and how is to look at how other nations, Europe, Canada, Mexico, Japan, China have dealt with COVID and post-COVID. And the assessment is that the U.S. has done the best job in coming out of COVID. And not that every economic issue is solved, but in terms of inflation going down and the recovery dramatically stronger than what was predicted, dramatically stronger than other nations, there's a lot to be said for the policy actions that have been taken by Congress in order to help the U.S. have this strong economic recovery. Now, on housing, I was a fair housing lawyer for 18 years before I got into state politics, and so this is a topic that's very, very close. I was also a local elected official and a governor dealing with the LIHTC, LIHTC, dealing with home funding and knowing how important it is. During my time now, nearly 30 years on July 1 in elected office from the local, state, and federal levels, I go around the state and talk to a lot of people, and I will say the cost of housing usually would be in the top 10 over much of my career and in the top 3 in Northern Virginia, but now it's top 5 everywhere in Virginia. I could go to the most rural parts of my Commonwealth or Northern Virginia, it's going to be a top 5 or a top 3 issue. So this is a significant one, and I would say particularly for first-time home buyers. The chairman put some stats in about that I think are important. The percentage of purchases that are first-time home buyers has been going down, and so we need to figure it out. One of the things I'm real concerned about are obstacles and barriers within housing that enable people, even if they could afford housing, to find obstacles in their way. And so I want to ask about a particular bill that I've been working on, the Fair Housing Improvement Act. The Housing Choice Voucher Program provides rental assistance to allow families to find rentals that work for them. There are other programs like Section 8 vouchers. VA has some housing choice vouchers. And in theory, families can use this assistance to move to neighborhoods of their choice and get access to schools, get access to transit, get access to jobs. However, what we find is many landlords and those who have rental properties say that they refuse to take vouchers. They refuse to take government income as a source of income, and they use that as a reason to turn people down. We don't accept Section 8 vouchers. We don't accept housing vouchers. We don't accept some of the VA vouchers. I think there's a significant body of evidence that suggests that that's pretextual. The notion of we don't take vouchers, you'll take somebody's pay stub when they could be sacked tomorrow as evidence of their ability to pay. Somebody having a voucher is a much more likely long-term reliable source of income than anybody's pay stub would be. What we've seen around the country, including in Virginia, is Commonwealth and states adding to the fair housing laws and prohibiting discrimination on the grounds of source of income. I introduced a bill first with Senator Orrin Hatch to do this. Utah was one of the early states in the country that prohibited discrimination on the source of income, and we haven't yet been able to get that passed. I have helped and encouraged Virginia to pass it at the Commonwealth level, and I think it's working. But I have a bill at the federal level, and I guess I'd like to ask Ms. Bailey, how would you see something like the Fair Housing Improvements Act making it easier for people to afford housing when they have a source of income that would enable them to pay the rent?
No, thanks, Senator, and thanks for the work on this really important issue, because we also know that source of income discrimination can also be a proxy for racial discrimination, right, and discrimination for people with disabilities, because we know the voucher program serves all people, and particularly people with disabilities and people of color. So this is critically important, and it can make a difference. What's also, having a law is important. Also, putting the resources behind enforcement of the law is a critical component of any source of income anti-discrimination measures, because we have to make sure that landlords know that there will be action taken if they discriminate against voucher holders, because we just need everyone to be able to have a safe place to call home.
Great, thank you. Last thing I'll say and then hand it back, Mr. Chair, is I'm a big fan of the LIHTC program. Just watching how the Virginia Housing, used to be the Virginia Housing Development Authority, uses those federal dollars to incentivize the construction of low and moderate income rental property, and putting requirements in that means significant percentages of those receiving the LIHTC funding have to be accessible units for seniors, for folks with disabilities. that much of the accessible housing stock in Virginia has been produced through smart use of LIHTC. And so I'm a strong believer that you don't have to create a new program when you have one that's working. You just need to do more of it. And I think LIHTC is one of those. With that, thanks to the witnesses, I hand it back.
And thank you to Senator Kane for his extremely knowledgeable leadership in this area. Senator Padilla.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Maybe not for as many years as Senator Kim, but I too have the diversity of experience, having started in local government, a member of the Los Angeles City Council once upon a time, having served a couple terms in the California legislature before coming to the Senate. So I've seen the challenges of creating additional housing, whether it's the need for additional affordable housing, the housing affordability crisis, through multiple angles. And so, yes, our housing crisis is primarily a crisis of supply at this point. Haven't been intimately familiar with negotiating deals and seeing successful developments and those that were great visions but failed to come to fruition. It's because of oftentimes the bottlenecks or the bureaucracy and the well-intentioned measures to regulate housing production have also at times become a barrier to increasing the housing supply that a growing population needs. Typically, a developer must first secure a site before pursuing subsidies in the forms of grants or loans from multiple sources to amass the capital necessary before then applying for tax credits, if that's what it takes to get a project to pencil. Clearly, that can take a long time, often years and years and years. This has essentially also shut out small-scale developers who lack the financial resources or expertise to navigate government bureaucracy, and has increasingly driven builders to turn to the private sector for capital to fund permanent and affordable housing units. But most of us agree housing is a human right, and private investment alone cannot be the solution to the housing crisis. We must provide additional funding to improve the efficiency of the traditional affordable housing development process in order to increase the pace of housing production to keep up with the need that's clearly out there. Question for both Ms. Bailey and Ms. Ventura. How could we streamline federal programs so that developers can more easily navigate and maximize available public funds?
Thank you, Senator, for this question. First, what I think is critically important is to think about the HUD programs that have been put together to invest in capital resources. Those programs were developed independent of each other and not designed to be able to necessarily work together. So they're critically important, but they also haven't been reauthorized in quite some time. So looking at those programs collectively so that we can streamline them, make them easier to work together, and do exactly as you suggest, close those gaps, because in development, time is money.
Ms. Ventura, same question.
Thank you. I would certainly echo what Ms. Bailey had to say, Senator. I think that it's like a jigsaw puzzle when you try to put these transactions together. They are complicated and they're difficult, and very often we will provide technical assistance to help developers get through that process, but certainly agreeing that streamlining process on a federal level, aligning the programs better, would certainly help expedite the process.
Thank you. Look forward to working with both of you to pursue that, recognizing that, first of all, we need the input from the folks who practice this, to develop in community, but also recognizing that what it takes to build in Los Angeles is going to be different than what it is to build in Bakersfield, California, which is going to be different than Texas versus New York versus Montana, et cetera. Want to make sure in my time remaining to touch on one other area, and that's homelessness and the lack of affordable housing are not new issues, but clearly unacceptable that more than 650,000 people, I'm talking veterans, families, young people, seniors, experience homelessness on any given night in the United States each and every year. And even more Americans experience housing insecurity. So they may not be experiencing homelessness yet, but one small stroke of bad luck, and they may very well find themselves in that situation, which is why I was proud to introduce my Housing for All Act, which would strategically surge federal investments in existing programs to reduce housing insecurity and increase funding for innovative, locally developed solutions. As Senator Kane said, if we have successful programs, don't need additional programs to compete with them. Let's just amplify, let's scale up. Homelessness is not just an urban or just a rural issue. It's not just a red state or just a blue state issue. It affects all states, all counties, all communities. Ms. Bailey, what innovative solutions could the federal government invest in to keep more people housed and prevent more Americans from falling into homelessness?
So the pandemic actually showed us the way in this space. With the Emergency Housing Voucher Program, HUD was given additional flexibility to alter how the voucher program worked and gave housing authorities additional resources to provide the services and be able to lease up a population that we generally consider among the hardest to serve, folks who have been experiencing homelessness. And housing authorities were able to do that in record time. This has been one of the more successful programs we've had in being able to take a resource from Congress and house folks quickly. The other thing I would say is experimentation in how to streamline the voucher program would be really critical. And one idea is to provide direct rental assistance to tenants. Right now, rental assistance goes to the landlord. If we could provide rental assistance that looks more like cash from the landlord's perspective, it could get rid of some of the source of income discrimination and streamline the process so that renters would be able to use the dollars more flexibly.
Right. My time is up, but I just call my colleagues' attention to not just helping address housing affordability in the short term, but you can appreciate the ripple effects in terms of greater economic benefit for local communities, for the state, and for the nation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Next up, Senator Braun.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Heard coming in successful programs and the things we try to do through the federal government. Always commend any good idea that looks like it's got sustainability and is actually addressing a problem. I can tell you when I travel across my own state, the issues that come up most often would be the high cost of health care, workforce, and if it's not third, it's fourth, would be affordable housing and high-speed internet. So my concern is I think you're always going to get decent ideas, but for them to be dependable, it's got to be based on a foundation of sustainable financing. And what concerns me most, and we're in the Budget Committee, is that we've got to pay more attention to that regardless of what topic we're talking about. And here, of course, it's housing. So I think my concern, and I'd like to get some opinions on what you think about sustainability when I'll cite these numbers and how confident you'd be that the business partner, the federal government's going to be there for the good idea that might come across the legislative bowels, so to speak. We were $5 trillion in debt, I think, cumulatively up through the Bush administration. Added another $5 trillion from 2000 to 2008. To keep score, that's $10 trillion. From 8 to 16, the Obama administration, we added another $6 trillion. That's $16 trillion. Structuralized annual deficits, meaning cumulative debt with it, at $1 trillion a year, 17 and 18. I arrive in 18 and have been the loudest voice on for whatever you like through the federal government. Hopefully, you'd get the operation working, prioritize, and make the best decisions. Well, COVID came along and kind of blew the doors off that thought. That was a kind of a once, hopefully, in a century thing that we have to contend with. I think we spent a ton of money. They just added, every penny was borrowed, basically. Net result is we're $34 trillion in debt. And the only template out there has been put out by the White House. It has us $42 trillion in debt in 5 years, 52 in 10 years. I'm not going to go through the arithmetic, but start pricing in part of the interest rate increase, it's going to overwhelm the system. Indiana University, we appreciate balanced budgets. We generate one annually. We live within our means. And I want to ask a few others the same question. Does it make sense to be talking about more when we're burdening future generations at the tune of $1 trillion every 6 months currently that we borrow? Mr. Walker.
So the numbers themselves are alarming. As a percentage of GDP, they're increasing, which means deficits as a percentage of GDP are going to continue to go up. As I'll defer to my testimony, making a very tight link between Treasury interest rates, which are supported by fiscal policy, and mortgage rates, which is all about housing affordability. I think there's a very tight link there. So what concerns me is we do have an amazing economic recovery, and yet we continue to spend higher and higher fractions of GDP, which means debt-GDP ratios are going to increase. And as I said in my testimony, I think this is going to put upward pressure on 10-year U.S. Treasuries, which is going to put upward pressure on mortgage rates. Which
ironically, housing is the most sensitive part of our economy to that very phenomenon.
Absolutely, and that's going to make housing much less affordable.
Thank you. Mr. Slover.
Yeah, I think as part of my testimony, I think, you know, and in listening to everybody on the panel as well, I just think we have an idea versus execution problem, as I said before. I think the inefficiencies of the execution, at least in the places I've been in government, in the D.C. Housing Authority, in the Chicago Public Schools, Detroit Public Schools, I've worked in a lot of small cities. Inefficiencies are abounding, and so I think that what you have to do.
If you took care of the inefficiencies, could you still take on the onslaught of those heavy numbers I just described with our current behavior?
Well, I think what I'm trying to say is I think what you have to do is before you can continue to ask for more and more money, you have to actually have accountability. You have to have a return on investment. You have to understand are you being efficient with the money that you have?
That's a great point.
Prior to asking for more.
And bravo. Okay, Mr. Boyce, would you want to weigh in on that?
Thank you, Senator. The only thing that I would add, so my background a little bit here is I'm an investment banker by practice and license, and I was the former treasurer of the state of Ohio. And I firmly believe, I certainly believe what Mr. Slover was saying, but I firmly believe that analyzing debt is more about not how much you have of debt, but your ability to pay on it.
So you feel good about, with everything I just mentioned, that we'd have the ability to pay? I come from the finance world, and I can tell you the biggest issue we're going to have as a country, and it's inevitable, the numbers never relent, will be that you couldn't extrapolate what you just said into this place working reasonably. Sooner or later, you can't just keep doing that, can you?
But embedded in that is the ability to pay on your debt. And again, what I look at—
Principal as well as interest?
Of course. Embedded in that, though, in the debt is the job creation and all of the various tentacles that expand from job creation. When you talk about LIHTC and the use of those tools and what it actually means in the bigger sense of the debt allocation there you're talking about creating stable housing opportunities so that families can become self-sustaining, so that they don't have to rely upon the system. And so somewhere in this conversation is balance. Somewhere in this conversation is reasonable analysis of both your ability to manage your debt and your ability to pay on your debt.
Thank you.
Senator Braun, thank you very much, and I now turn to Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank all of you for being here today to talk about this very important subject. And clearly, housing affordability is a huge issue everywhere in our country. I hear about it all the time in the state of Maryland. And the lack of adequate supply is a big piece of that, and we need to look for more ways to incentivize and encourage more supply. It's also very important, in my view, that we continue to support the rental assistance programs like the Housing Choice Voucher Program. I've introduced a bipartisan bill along with Senator Todd Young of Indiana. It's entitled the Family Stability and Opportunity Vouchers Act, and what it does is make use of the housing choice vouchers combined with wraparound services for families with young children. And there's been ample research, including by Raj Chetty, that indicates that when you provide families with that opportunity to move to greater areas of greater opportunity, both the housing component as well as wraparound services, you see significant breaks in generational poverty. Ms. Bailey, I know that you've looked at these issues broadly, the Housing Choice Voucher Program, the impact on making sure that kids have a secure place to call home. Could you comment on why it's important both to maintain that, but also to look at providing these wraparound services for families with young kids?
Yeah, absolutely, Senator. And this actually ties well to Senator Braun's question as well, right? We have to remember that there's a cost to doing nothing as well. There's a cost to families and to kids and to people who are living unhoused on the street to doing nothing that oftentimes isn't talked about. There's also, we also talk about affordable housing as purely a issue of homelessness. It is a larger issue than that. Many people are currently housed. If we gave them a little bit more assistance to be able to afford where they live today, then that also controls the affordability crisis as well. And that stems into how the role that housing can play in children's lives. We know that children with stable housing do better in school, in the long run, as Dr. Chetty's work shows, earn more as adults. And it's the wraparound services that are the secret sauce to that. Being able to help families connect to childcare locally, being able to help families navigate the school system, and staying with families for as long as they need it, and even if they, and as flexibly as they need services is a key component of that.
Well, I appreciate that. So Senator Young and I pushed a number of years ago to create a pilot program to help these families with young kids move to areas of greater opportunity with those wraparound services. And it very quickly demonstrated what the research has shown, which is this is a way to help break the cycle of poverty, which is why we proposed to expand that particular program by 250,000 vouchers over the next 5 years. As we indicated, all of you have indicated in your testimony, supply is another major factor here. In December of last year, Axios estimated, based on data from the Census Bureau and Moody's, that there's a shortage of around 3.2 million housing units relative to population demand in the United States. I know in my home state of Maryland, we're talking about a shortage of at least 96,000 units. There are a number of programs designed to help address the supply thing. You've all mentioned the low-income housing tax credit piece. There's also the Home Investment Partnership Program, CDBG. If you could, Ms. Ventura and maybe Mr. Boyce, just speak briefly to how those programs can help expand the supply of housing and therefore improve the situation with respect to affordability.
They are the programs that you mentioned, the Home Program, the Capital Magnet Fund, the National Housing Trust, are all critically important programs, and we use them in partnership with the 9% credits, the 4% housing credits. Without those resources, we would not have the numbers that we have in Rhode Island in terms of production and preservation of housing. So they are terrific programs. We hope for more resources to be invested in these programs so that we can do more for the people of our state. Thank you.
Mr. Boyce. Thank you for the question, Senator. I would just add to Carol's comments that CDBG funds, in particular in home funds, I know in Franklin County, have allowed us to use those funds to invest in infrastructure dollars that often can tie directly into a specific development to reduce the cost of rent or the cost of purchase on those homes. And so to me, that's a direct correlation to the ability to access more affordable and quality housing. The other point I would like to raise is just that it allows us as counties to think about the public infrastructure, ranging from roads and streets to public transit access, and even planning of medical resources, medical institutions, and so forth. And so all of those are things that we as county commissioners take into account when we're planning out the growth or development of certain corridors within our community.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Merkley.
The shortage that my colleague from Maryland mentioned is certainly true in Oregon. We're estimated about 110,000 units short. But in addition, we have the challenge that any developer wants to develop high-end housing because there's so many folks to the south of us in California, in the San Francisco area, where the .com boosted the value of houses, so you can sell your house for $1 million+ move to Oregon. So there's a ready supply of buyers for high-end, and so a developer doesn't want to develop normal family housing when they can make more money building McMansions. I want to turn to a different part of the puzzle, though, and that is the involvement in hedge funds. Since 2009, when we had massive foreclosures, they were sold in bulks of 1,000 or more houses at a time. The only people who could buy them were hedge funds. Hedge funds discovered that this was a fabulous investment, both from appreciation that would have gone to middle-class families. I lobbied the Obama administration hard to make them available to families because they were being sold 50 cents on the dollar at the time. And they said it was just too complicated, and they were worried about slowing a process where houses might be exposed to frozen pipes or vandals stripping copper or so forth. But the long and short of it is the hedge funds became deeply invested in this market, and they've continued to do so, seeing how fabulously profitable it is. They're buying now about a quarter of the houses that are available, especially in the southern markets, places like Phoenix and Atlanta. But it's affecting states like Oregon as well. Ms. Bailey, this situation affects rents and the price of home ownership both. And people said, well, how does it affect the renters? And my basic understanding that I want clarification from you on is, first of all, if an investor pays more for a house, they're going to charge higher rents, going to drive up the rental market in general. But also, if renters who have the income to buy a house can no longer buy a house because they're competing against a hedge fund, that means they don't move out of the rental housing, and that rental housing supply is going to remain shorter and therefore at a higher market price. Can you help us understand, are the hedge funds having an impact on the affordability of rents as well as home ownership?
Yes, Senator, as you explained it, that's exactly right. We're really concerned about renters, especially higher income renters who are staying in the market longer than they would otherwise, and therefore driving up the cost because 30% of their income is higher, and so they can pay more. But we're also concerned for the renter themselves, not only paying more rent, but also for families, in particular families with kids. Single-family housing is one of the ways that is really important to them. It provides the size. It's often in places with better schools and other amenities that families with kids need. And so we really need to maintain an affordability in the single-family rental market for low-income families with kids.
I really saw when I was director of Habitat for Humanity how an affordable mortgage or affordable rental housing was huge to the stability of family. And I saw kids whose lives improved enormously when they had that stake in the community through an affordable, decent home in a decent community. Ms. Ventura, your organization has helped tens of thousands of families enter home ownership through mortgage finance programs. And I'm like, tens of thousands, that's awesome. That is tremendous. Now, if the hedge funds are targeting, if they were, and I don't know to what degree they are, start targeting Rhode Island and driving up the prices, how would that affect the opportunity of families to buy homes? Because they've been competing against all cash, no inspection offers at a higher price point than the houses have been at shortly before.
So, Senator, I haven't heard that hedge funds are buying properties in Rhode Island. It's possible. I think that single-family opportunities in Rhode Island, the opportunity to either lease a home or purchase a home is challenging. We're not building enough single-family inventory now. You mentioned Habitat, and thank you for your work with Habitat. Our Habitat affiliates in Rhode Island do a terrific job providing just those opportunities, but we need to do more in our state in providing financing opportunities to develop that next level, leaving rental, home ownership, affordable home ownership, and the ability to build wealth.
Thank you, and I hope for your sake they don't start to target Rhode Island. You can visit your colleagues in Atlanta and Phoenix to find out the impact, or in Oregon. Ms. Bailey, several state legislatures, including Oregon, have considered creating a rental housing registry system to provide clear data on landlords and homes in the rental market to really understand the dynamics of that market better. Would the benefits outweigh the challenges in setting up this kind of registry system?
Senator, it could really help. Sometimes it's a black box related to renting and being able to locate units for families. So putting in the resources that it would take to be able to, and making it as easy as possible for landlords to register, putting in the resources to maintain a system like that could play a significant role in helping families find a place to live. Right now, we know that housing authorities and other housing agencies are having to use resources to pay for realtors and others who have to, in order to help people with low incomes find rental units. Oftentimes, many of us have to do the same thing. Having such a registry could make a difference in just making it easier to access a rental housing.
Well, I'll just close out with a comment on the hedge fund side. We have all our traditional programs, for example, housing vouchers. I spent an afternoon calling in the west side of Portland trying to find an apartment that would take a housing voucher, and all the rents were way above the housing voucher, so I didn't find one. And I just did that for kind of understand it personally. So we have to amplify all of those programs, but we also have this factor since 2009 that has become a competitor with ordinary American families for basic 3-bedroom family, 2 or 3-bedroom family house. That is something we could do that could make a profound difference that doesn't cost the government a single dime, and then we should do it. We should get the hedge funds out of the housing business. Thanks.
Thank you, Senator Merkley. Here's what we're going to do. We have a vote that will start in a couple minutes. Senator Johnson has one additional point or question. I have one for Ms. Ventura, and then we're going to adjourn the hearing. Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Whitehouse did ask Mr. Slover if he would give some thought to and provide questions for the record. I kind of want to make the same request from all of you. And this is a very sincere request. As I said in my questioning, and it's been kind of reinforced throughout this thing, we've got a problem here of supply, but we have tremendous demand, whether it's from hedge funds, whether it's from $100 billion plus of government funding. Again, I come from the free market system. I've got a great deal of respect for how a functioning market responds to demand, on high end all the way down to low end products. So there's a breakdown in the marketplace. I have my suspicion. I used one example of a very well-intentioned program that I'm sure does a lot of good, the low-income housing tax credit, but it has some unintended consequences. And Mr. Slover, you talked about it, unintended consequences in the D.C. market as well. So I guess I'm really asking all of you to give some real thought to what is the fundamental root causes. And again, I think it is a little more complex. I think there are a number of factors in here, but what is preventing the market from responding to the demand? I mean, when you heard a figure, 3.3 million housing units, so that's a market opportunity. And it doesn't necessarily have to be $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 homes. I know in Oshkosh, a philanthropist funded, I think, something like 50 micro housing units for families to get in. And again, maybe not where everybody want to live, but it's clean, it's safe. There are alternatives here the marketplace can respond to. So it's really a very sincere request. If you can really rack your brain and go, what is preventing the market from responding with all this demand? There's tremendous demand. There's tremendous dollars being thrown at this. Why do we have such a constriction of the supply.
If I could, just to go back to what I was talking about my fair housing career, first-time home ownership really important, and yet there's significant racial disparities. The racial home ownership gap in Virginia is more than 20%. A lot of the federal programs we've talked about today deal with affordable renters, and that's rentals, and of course that's very, very important. But I think we need to look at smart strategies that will help more people become homeowners. I've joined with Senators Warner and Warnock on a bill, the LIFT Act, which would provide more affordable mortgage options for first-generation homeowners. And I understand, Ms. Ventura, that RI Housing has piloted a down payment and closing cost assistance program for first-generation home buyers who complete a homeowner education course. Talk a little bit about that program and what you've learned that might be helpful to us as we think about trying to do something similar.
Yes, thank you for asking about this program. We did pilot a first-gen down payment assistance program. It is geographically targeted in areas that have very high concentrations of low-income renters. So there tends to be in our urban core, and we provide a $25,000 grant to participants in the program. They have to complete a higher level of homebuyer assistance than a traditional down payment assistance program. We think that's important to educate them as they are first-generation buyers. And so they can take that $25,000 down payment and buy anywhere in the state of Rhode Island, and we're seeing a high percentage of people purchasing in what we would call high opportunity areas, great schools. So we believe we're certainly moving the dial on creating homeownership opportunities for people of color. And we plan to continue it. One other thing I would add, Senator, is we created a Home Secure program that accompanies this. It's a $5,000 escrow that we create for participants in the program, and it's almost like a security deposit if something goes wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And so
A major system furnace or something, yeah.
Exactly, exactly. So they can use that, if they use their resources to pay for the boiler, if it goes, then they can use that security fund to make their mortgage payment. If at the end of 5 years they don't use the resource, or whatever the balance is, we apply a principal reduction to their mortgage.
Thank you for sharing about that, and to all the witnesses, this has been a really good hearing. Appreciate the work that you all do, your willingness to testify today. We obviously have included your full written statements in the record as information for all senators. Should any senators have questions, and you've gotten a couple questions from the record from Senator Johnson and Senator Whitehouse, particularly to Mr. Slover and others. If any other senators want to put questions in from the record, we would ask that they do that by noon tomorrow. Email copies will be accepted, and then if there are such questions, some have been raised already, we would ask witnesses to try to respond within 7 days of receipt. With no further business before the committee and with a vote on, the hearing is adjourned.